story of war, and here we have no Gita to draw it for us. Insofar as the story of love, and the history of love too for that matter, is a tale of suffering, a man might conclude that it would be better for him never to engage in love, much as he might conclude from the story of war that it would be better for him never to go to war. Or, if he is already involved in love, he might conclude that he should withdraw from it, much as he might conclude that he should have nothing further to do with war. On the other hand, he might realize that he is so involved in love that he cannot truly withdraw from it or avoid entering into it, that fleeing from sexuality is tantamount to fleeing from mortality and attempting to be more than mortal man. This would be like realizing that he is so implicated in the wars and struggles of mankind that he cannot really escape them or stand aloof from them. One way of going about it would be to make stories of our experience of love and war, stories of war and journey and creation such as we found in the ancient epics. The limitation of the Gita was that it dealt only with war and not with love. We must attempt something of its kind, but dealing with love as well as with war. Perhaps we should try to combine the Hindu story of incarnation with the Christian story, for what the Gita does with war, the Gospels do with love. This, if we do it, will amount to transforming poetry into poetry, to be sure, but it will also mean transforming truth into poetry insofar as our own experience of love and war will have to guide us in making over the poetry. Let the literary form of our poetry be that of an essay of the imagination rather than that of verse. Kierkegaard drew upon the poetry of the Gospels in what he called an essay of the imagination, in his famous parable of the king who loved a humble maiden. Let us go and do likewise, but with the Gospels and the Gita, with love and with war. Consider the following parable. I call it the parable of the mountain. Man, let us say, is climbing a mountain. At the top of the mountain, he thinks, is God. Down in the valley are the cares and concerns of human life, all the troubles of love and war. By climbing the mountain and reaching the top, man hopes to escape from all these miseries. God, on the other hand, is coming down the mountain, let us say, his desire being to plunge himself into the very things that man wishes to escape. Man's desire is to be God. God's is to be man. God and man pass one another going in opposite directions. When man reaches the top of the mountain, he is going to find nothing. God is not there. Let us suppose that man does reach the top and does make this discovery. Or suppose that he passes God on the way, or finds God's tracks leading downwards, or hears a rumor that God is descending the mountain. One way or another man learns that climbing was a mistake and that what he seeks is to be found only by going down into the valley. He turns around, therefore, and starts going down the mountain. He sets his face towards love and war, where before he had turned his back upon them. Experimenting with truth in the experience or truth to which this parable gives expression is twofold. There is the experience of climbing and the experience of going down the mountain. The one is the experience of escaping, or at least attempting to escape, the troubles of love and war. The other is the contrary experience of deliberately plunging oneself into those troubles. Earlier we said that a man cannot truly withdraw from the troubles of love and war. Here we are saying that there is a truth of withdrawal and a truth of return. What we said earlier is perhaps what a man might say on his return, comparing the experience of withdrawal with that of return. Maybe to say that he cannot truly withdraw is the same as saying that he does not find God at the top of the mountain, or that the God he finds is not the true God. He would only say this after he had somehow experienced an emptiness at the top of the mountain and a fullness at the bottom of the valley. It might be illuminating to compare and contrast our story with Plato's well-known parable of the cave, 1 registered according to Plato's parable, man lives in an underground cave and sees only by firelight. If a man were to climb up into the world above and see by sunlight, he would realize that he had been living in a world of shadows. If then he were to descend once more into the cave underground, he might try telling the men still living there about the daylight world. There is an ascent and a descent in Plato's story as in ours, but the truth is found in his by ascending. The only purpose of descending again is to bring the truth to others. Thus it could seem that our parable of the mountain is the exact reverse of the parable of the cave. Yet this is not quite so. If the wisdom which is found at the top of the ascent is a negative wisdom, a knowledge of ignorance degree like the wisdom of Socrates, then it might well compare with the experience of emptiness at the top of the mountain. If, on the other hand, the experience of fullness at the bottom of the valley arises from a sharing of truth with others, then it might well compare with the experience of returning to the cave. What our parable would be saying that Plato's parable does not say is, first of all, that the ascent is at once a pursuit and a flight, that in climbing the mountain a man is pursuing the truth but he is also fleeing from the things he dreads in the valley, love and war. The fear of love drives a man to the pursuit of autonomy. He desires to be so self-contained, to have such inner wealth that he will need no other person outside of himself. He fears needing another, having his happiness depend on another, having to bring along others with him wherever he goes. It is like the many-body problem in physics and mathematics. The motion of one body is a simple matter. The two-body problem is much more complex and much harder to solve. The three-body problem is thought to be insoluble. The happiness of one person likewise seems quite feasible, that of two is considerably more difficult to achieve, that of more than two seems almost unattainable. Thus a man could well be afraid of involving himself with others in the pursuit of happiness. This would be the thing he dreads in love. Still, the fear of love is as ambivalent as the fear of falling. A man clings to the side of the mountain for fear of falling, and yet he is tempted to look down, and the fascination of it may actually cause him to fall. He desires autonomy and he fears losing it, and yet there is another side of him which is fascinated by the thought of losing autonomy and of taking away the autonomy of others. The ambition to which the fear of war drives a man is much akin to that of autonomy. It is that of power. He desires to have such power as to be unassailable, such strength that no one would dare attack him. He fears being involved in any kind of conflict with others, being in danger of losing his life or his reputation or whatever else he holds dear, being compelled to fight for these things and to gamble with them. Climbing the mountain in fear of love, a man is searching for solitude. Climbing it in fear of war, he is searching for a vantage point, a retreat, a fastness. The fear of war is as ambivalent as the fear of love. It is not at all peaceful. It drives a man to stockpile weapons, to make himself ever more powerful and ever less assailable. What he would want most of all, it is true, is a perfectly bloodless victory in which he would so terrify his enemy as to make him surrender or flee or never even approach. The dread of actually being attacked, of actually having to fight, of actually risking defeat, though, can fascinate him with the weapons of war. It can fascinate him with power and lead him into. It is like the vertigo we find in the fear of love. It will not lead him to climb down, it will lead him to fall down the mountain. Let us suppose, nevertheless, that he does not fall, that he actually reaches the top, that he achieves autonomy and power, that he is safe at last from the troubles of love and war. What is it like there at the top? The essence of both autonomy and power, I would say, is knowledge. It is knowledge that gives a man a rich interior life, so that he is less in need of friends outside of himself. It is knowledge that gives him the tactics and strategy to defeat any enemies. he will probably never reach the top of the mountain if he tries to achieve power and autonomy through something more external than knowledge, for instance through money. For this would make him dependent on things outside himself and would leave him weak and insufficient in himself. Yet even his knowledge, however interior it is to him, is knowledge of something, and to that extent is dependent on the outside. The only way we can make him completely autonomous and get his power completely inside of him is to make his knowledge its own object. This is Aristotle's definition of God, a knowing of knowing, and it became Hegel's definition of the autonomous human spirit. A knowing of knowing would be like a view from a mountaintop. By knowing all about knowing itself, one would know in some manner everything there is to know. It would be like seeing everything from a great height. One would see everything near and far, all the way to the horizon, but there would be some loss of detail on account of the distances. The knowing of knowing would mean being in possession of all the various methods of knowing. It would mean knowing how an artist thinks, putting a thing together, knowing how a scientist thinks, taking a thing apart, knowing how a practical man thinks, sizing up a situation, knowing how a man of understanding thinks, grasping the principle of a thing, knowing how a man of wisdom thinks, reflecting upon human experience. It could mean being able to think in all these ways, being an artist, a scientist, a practical man, a man of understanding and a man of wisdom all in one. What it could not mean, if we are to make it, is actually having put all things together, ten all things apart, sized up all situations, grasped all principles, and underscore reflected upon all human experience. Of course we could imagine a God who had equivalently done all these things, a God who by the knowing of knowing would, without any restriction, know all there is to know. He would have the richest imaginable interior life and so would have no need of anyone or anything outside of himself. Also, insofar as knowledge is power, he would have the greatest imaginable power, and his power would be the power of knowledge. His also would be a view from the mountaintop, but his sight would be keener than man's and would not be obscured by the distances. He would be the envy of man, the implicit ideal of all man's striving in climbing up the mountain. In Zen tradition there was a mad poet called Han Shan, Cold Mountain. He is pictured dressed in rags and leaning on a broom. To those who thought he was crazy, his advice in one of his poems was, try and make it to Cold Mountain too. Perhaps we should say the same about our mountain. It is all very well for us to say that ultimately the thing for man to do is turn around and go down the mountain into the valley. Only one who has climbed the mountain and seen what there is on top can understand what this is all about. One would have to know what things look like from the mountaintop, what the knowing of knowing is like, what peace of mind there is in being somehow beyond the troubles of love and war, before one would know what one is doing, deliberately going down the mountain and entering into the valley. Maybe the only thing that can be said to a man before he has finished climbing is, try and make it to Cold Mountain. At the top of the mountain, as we have been describing it, there is a kind of madness, not the madness that consists in having lost one's reason, but a madness that consists in having lost everything except one's reason. The knowing of knowing, to be sure, seems worthy of God and worthy of man. The only thing wrong is that man at the top of the mountain, by escaping from love and war, will have lost everything else. He will have withdrawn into that element of his nature which is most characteristic of him and sets him apart from other animals. It is the thing in him which is most human. Perhaps indeed he will never realize what it is to be human unless he does attempt this withdrawal. Even so, the realization that he has lost everything except his reason, that he has found pure humanity but not full humanity, changes his wisdom from a knowledge of knowledge into a knowledge of ignorance. He realizes that he has something yet to learn, something that he cannot learn at the top of the mountain but only at the bottom of the valley. Once a man has been to the top of the mountain, he can never be the same. He will inevitably be something of a Hanshan, a cold mountain, for the rest of his life, and he will always retain the ability to return once again to cold mountain if he finds the valley intolerable. He cannot simply forget what it is like up there and plunge into the affairs of the valley, as if he could be transported from the top to the bottom without actually climbing down. Rather, he must descend the mountain, step by step, perhaps by the same paths as he ascended. If at the summit he experienced a knowing of knowing, he will be unable simply to forget his knowledge and turn to love and war. He will have to come to love and war by means of knowledge. He will have to make his way to them through the art, the science, the prudence, the understanding, the wisdom of loving and of warfare. He will have to think his way through autonomy in order to plunge himself into love. He will have to think his way through power in order to plunge himself into war. Going from an ideal of autonomy to one of love, he will probably have to think of love as the love of autonomous persons for one another, a love in which autonomy is not violated. A love in which he were to give up his autonomy or take away that of another person would appear evil to him. He would describe it, no doubt, as using another person or being used by another. His ethic will be the rule that a person is to be treated as an end and never as a means to an end. For the art of loving for him will be the art of making love within the limits imposed by the ethic of autonomy, loving and yet not enslaving the other person, being loved and yet preserving his own freedom. In analyzing his relations with others, as he will be very prone to do, he will tend to be suspicious of any taint of using or enslavement. These will be the terms in which he will tend to size up situations of love, for instance triangles in which two persons are in love with one. The principle of love as he understands it will be distance in intimacy, rather than pure intimacy. The lessons he will learn from the experience of love, however, with such ideals, will probably be somewhat discouraging lessons, how the distance between two persons can abolish their intimacy, or how the intimacy between them can abolish their distance. When it comes to war, he will be torn between using violence to do away with the enslavement of some human beings by others and abstaining from violence as itself a violation of the autonomy of others. Coming from an ideal of power to one of struggling for freedom, he will probably have to think of freedom as power, especially the kind of power he has known, the power of knowledge. War he will see as being much more a battle of wits than a clash of brute forces. This will be partly a carryover from his old desire for bloodless victories and his fear of bloody fighting, partly a result of his new desire to avoid doing violence. The science of war for him will be the analysis of every battle into a battle of wits. The art of war will be in turning every clash of brute forces into such a battle. The prudence of war will be in sizing up a struggle and seeing what is possible and what is impossible in it to force and to wit. The understanding of war will be in grasping the principle at work in human struggles, that the outcome is never victory for one side but a resultant of the opposing purposes. But the wisdom of war, the lessons he will learn from it, like those he learns from love, may turn out to be somewhat discouraging, how the clash of brute forces is not easily changed into a battle of wits and how the result is likely to be mutual destruction rather than the realization of some higher good. These discouraging lessons which he learns about love and war will show him that he is still climbing down the mountain, that he, experimenting with true one, hasn't yet reached the bottom. There is a wisdom at the bottom of the mountain, let us say, just as there is at the top. The God we imagined at the top had a wisdom which amounted to a knowing of knowing, a knowledge which gave him complete and inviolable autonomy. If we were to imagine a God at the bottom, we would have to imagine him possessing a wisdom which could see through autonomy itself. he would be like the incarnate God of Christianity and Hinduism. He would know, like Jesus, that love means giving up autonomy, giving it up autonomously. Maybe, no one takes my life from me, I lay it down of myself, degree, but giving it up nonetheless. He would know, like Krishna, that war means being in real opposition to other persons, perhaps without seeking thereby to make them means to an end, renouncing the fruits of action, but being in opposition to them nonetheless. When autonomy is still the prime value, giving it up can only seem to be masochism, taking it away can only seem to be sadism. This is the way things appear to a man fleeing from the affairs of the valley and trying to make his way to the top of the mountain. He is indeed tempted to masochism and sadism. This is the way love and war look to him when he looks at them over his shoulder, fleeing from them. The masochism he is tempted to does indeed amount to giving up personal autonomy, the sadism amounts to taking away the autonomy of other persons. But the perverse pleasure which tempts him in the thought of these things is nothing more than the perverse fascination contained in his fears. His temptation to masochism is the fascination which accompanies his fear of love and sexuality. His temptation to sadism is the fascination which accompanies his fear of war and bloodshed. Coming down the mountain, he will see these same things ahead of him that he formerly saw behind him, but they will look different when he faces them squarely from the way they looked when he glanced at them backwards and asquint. As he enters the valley, let us say, he sees that he must relinquish the solitude he enjoyed on the mountaintop, give up his autonomous existence and make himself available to others. Once he had thought availability to others a kind of masochism inspired by way of all the earth greed for the pleasure of giving. It would be a life in which there would be no receiving and no willingness to receive but only to give. It would have the effect not of enriching others but only of tainting them with the same greed. It would lead ultimately to giving his life in a kind of suicide, but this death too, like the life, would be fruitless to others, would only burden them with obligation to a similar death. Autonomy, on the other hand, he had conceived to be an ideal state in which giving and receiving would be in balance. There would be no greed, neither that of receiving nor that of giving. If he gave, it would be freely and without obligating the other person. If he received, it would be equally freely, without feeling any obligation to make a return. Now it seems to him that in fact there is no real giving or receiving in autonomy. Now he is looking back over his shoulder at autonomy. For real giving means giving himself, and thus, it seems to him, giving up his autonomy, making himself available to others, putting himself at the service of others, willingly becoming a means to the ends of others, and real receiving means letting another person do all this for him. He had considered war to be essentially a struggle between masters and slaves, or a struggle in which each side was attempting to make slaves of the other. Having no desire to be either a master or a slave, except for that perverse fascination, that sadism and masochism, in his fear of both, he had tried to rise above both of them and live an autonomous existence. Autonomy would be a state, he had thought, in which he would neither be dependent on others, nor have others dependent on him. Actually, it proved to be a state in which he was unrelated to others, in which he had neither friends nor enemies, not to mention masters or slaves. Coming back down from the mountain into the life of the valley, he makes friendship and love possible once more, but by the same act he also makes enmity and war possible. On this second look, however, war does not appear so thoroughly evil as it did before. It seems to him now that it is not merely a struggle between masters and slaves or a struggle to master and enslave. Rather, it is a human relationship, the relationship of enmity. A man can be at variance against another man, be without being either his master or his slave, and without eventually becoming either his master or his slave. Instead he can become his friend, or he can remain his enemy. Mastery and slavery are fruits of warfare which can be renounced. Renouncing mastery and slavery as fruits of warfare perhaps amounts to loving one's enemies. To love one's enemies implies that one has enemies, but if love really means anything here, that one treats them differently than one would otherwise. Only a man who had been to the top of the mountain and had the taste of autonomy would think of doing this. The same is true of sacrificing one's autonomy and receiving the sacrifice of another's autonomy in mutual love and friendship. Only a man to whom autonomy had been of value could value such a sacrifice. By going to the top of the mountain and coming back down again, therefore, a man does not simply waste his time. He ends up where he began, in the valley, but not in the same state of being. He climbed the mountain to escape from love and war, for he feared that love might so encumber and complicate his pursuit of happiness that he could never be happy, and that war might bring on the loss of everything he already possessed and of his hopes for the future besides. At the top of the mountain he found a self-sufficiency through knowledge, a knowledge which so enriched his inner life that he had no more need for other persons, and which made him so resourceful that he had nothing more to fear from others. When he realized that all he had was knowledge, though, that he had lost everything else by escaping from love and war, he turned around and started to make his way down into the valley again. At first he tried to enter into love and war without losing the self-sufficiency he had gained, but ultimately he found that he had to leave it at the top of the mountain. All he could bring with him was a memory of it and a sense of its relative value. Yet this in itself was enough to work a change for him in love and war down in the valley. His story is the story of a life and of a time. We have been telling of the withdrawal and return that can take place in an individual life, but simultaneously we have been telling of the historic withdrawal and return that seem to be taking place in our time. Gandhi's experiments with truth, if we do not reflect on them very deeply, can seem a part of the withdrawal. His Brahmacharya can seem a flight from love and his Satyagraha can seem a flight from war. Considered more carefully, though, his experiments appear to be rather a part of the return. The flight from love as we described it is a flight from the complications of pursuing the happiness of more than one person. Gandhi's celibacy was not a retreat from the two-person to the one-person situation so much as an advance from the two-person to the many-person situation. His Brahmacharya was an experiment in universal love. The flight from war we spoke of is a flight from the struggles of mankind and from the personal risks they involve. Gandhi's nonviolence was not a refusal to fight so much as a willingness to fight with a handicap, namely without using violence, and to run thereby a greater personal risk. In the struggles of mankind, his Satyagraha was an experiment in courage. Although it has been many centuries since a great religion shook the world, maybe one is rising now out of the meeting and confluence of the religions of the past. Gandhi's experiments with truth are perhaps an indication of what this religion may be like. Its truth need not be simply the common ground of the previous religions. Rather, it may be a more comprehensive truth like that to which Gandhi was led by trying to live both the Gita and the Gospel. The God we told of in the Valley of Love and War seemed to resemble both the incarnate God of love in the Gospel and the incarnate God of war in the Gita. Gandhi went on and tried to combine the truth not only of Christianity and Hinduism but also of Islam and Buddhism. Now let us in our turn, in our own experiments with the truth of the religions, work towards this comprehensive truth step by step. Or if we cannot reach a truth which embraces all the religions, let us try at least to embrace them all in poetry.